The story of Bismarck is often told as a dramatic hunt, a clash of steel and fire on the open Atlantic. But the real story begins much earlier, long before the first shell was fired, and it is far more unsettling. Bismarck was not simply a battleship. It was a symbol of a strategy that was already flawed the moment it was put to sea. Germany entered the Second World War knowing it could not defeat Britain in a direct naval confrontation. The Royal Navy was too large, too experienced, and too deeply rooted in global supply routes. From the very beginning, German naval planners understood that battleships like Bismarck could never win a decisive fleet battle. Instead, they were meant to serve a different purpose. They were tools of pressure, designed to terrorize shipping lanes, disrupt convoys, and slowly bleed Britain's economy through commerce raiding. This doctrine, known as guerre de course, shaped every decision surrounding Bismarck. Under Admiral Erich Raeder, the Kriegsmarine focused on avoiding unnecessary combat while striking where the enemy was weakest. The goal was not glory, but exhaustion. Starve Britain of resources, stretch its defenses thin, and force it to fight everywhere at once. In this context, Bismarck was built not as a duelist, but as a predator. Fast, heavily armed, and capable of long-range operations. It was designed to operate independently in the Atlantic. Yet this vision contained a fatal contradiction. A ship as large and powerful as Bismarck could not truly hide. Its very presence demanded attention. Every movement required coordination, secrecy, and perfect timing. The loss of surprise would turn strength into vulnerability. When Bismarck finally sailed in May 1941, it carried not only fuel and ammunition, but the weight of German naval ambition itself. Its mission was framed as calculated and controlled, but beneath the surface, it was already dangerously exposed. The Atlantic was not empty. British intelligence networks, patrols, and reconnaissance aircraft were waiting. Bismarck was entering a battlefield where mistakes could not be undone. And once the operation began, events would move faster than anyone on the German side expected, leaving no room for correction. Operation Rheinebong was conceived as a calculated gamble, not a desperate strike. The plan was simple in theory and dangerous in execution. Bismarck would break into the Atlantic alongside the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugene, using speed and firepower to evade British forces while attacking convoys. The success of earlier raids by Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had encouraged confidence. Those operations had proven that German surface raiders could disrupt British shipping if they avoided decisive engagements. Yet conditions in May 1941 were no longer favorable. Days were growing longer, weather windows were shrinking, and British radar coverage had improved dramatically. Despite these risks, political pressure and strategic ambition pushed the operation forward. Tirpitz, which was meant to accompany Bismarck, was not ready. This already weakened the mission before it began. A lone battleship, no matter how powerful, was far more vulnerable than a coordinated group. As Bismarck sailed from Gotenhafen, it passed into waters increasingly monitored by British patrols. Swedish observers spotted the task force early, and their reports quickly reached British intelligence. From that moment on, surprise was gone. The Royal Navy began assembling forces across the North Atlantic. Not yet knowing exactly where Bismarck would emerge, but fully aware that it had to be stopped. The first critical encounter occurred in the Denmark Strait. British cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk detected Bismarck using radar and began shadowing it relentlessly. This quiet phase of the hunt was more dangerous than open battle. Every radio transmission increased the risk of detection. Every evasive maneuver burned fuel that could not be replaced. Inside Bismarck, tension grew as the crew realized the enemy was already watching. The situation demanded a decision. Admiral Gunther Lugens, commanding the operation, chose strict adherence to orders. His mission was commerce raiding, not combat. Even when contact was made with British capital ships, his priority remained survival and continuation of the mission. This mindset would soon collide with reality. On the morning of May 24th, British forces closed in. The battle that followed would instantly reshape the entire operation. But even before the first shots were fired, Bismarck was already paying the price for strategic rigidity, delayed timing, and the loss of secrecy. The hunt was no longer theoretical. It was underway, and there would be no easy escape. The battle in the Denmark Strait unfolded with terrifying speed and irreversible consequences. At dawn on May 24th, the British battlecruiser Hood and the battleship Prince of Wales closed the distance, believing they could bring the German ships under fire before Bismarck could disengage. Hood carried enormous symbolic weight for the Royal Navy, representing decades of maritime dominance. Yet beneath that reputation lay a fatal weakness. Her deck armor was insufficient against plunging fire at long range. As the first salvos were exchanged, Bismarck's gunnery proved devastatingly precise. Within minutes, a shell penetrated Hood's vulnerable deck and detonated deep inside the ship. The explosion tore the battlecruiser apart in seconds. Over 1,400 men were lost almost instantly. Only 3 survived. The shock of Hood's destruction reverberated across the British fleet and reached London within hours. For Germany, it was a stunning tactical success. For Britain, it was a national trauma. Yet the battle was not over. Prince of Wales continued the fight, but suffered multiple hits and severe mechanical problems. She was forced to withdraw, leaving Bismarck momentarily victorious. However, this apparent triumph concealed a critical turning point. During the engagement, Bismarck had taken damage below the waterline. A fuel tank was ruptured, and oil began leaking into the sea. Her maximum speed was reduced, and her operational range was compromised. This single hit changed everything. The original plan depended on endurance, stealth, and mobility. Now Bismarck was bleeding fuel and leaving a visible trail. Captain Ernst Lindemann argued forcefully for an immediate return to port. He understood that the ship's primary advantage had been lost. Admiral Lutyens disagreed, bound by Raeder's strategic doctrine. He chose to continue toward the Atlantic and attempt to complete the commerce raiding mission. This decision sealed Bismarck's fate. The British, enraged by the loss of Hood, intensified the pursuit with unprecedented determination. Churchill himself demanded results. Every available ship and aircraft was committed to the hunt. What had begun as a calculated raiding operation had become a relentless chase across the Atlantic. Bismarck had won the battle, but the war at sea had turned decisively against her. After the destruction of Hood, the Atlantic became the stage for one of the most intense naval hunts in history. The British response was immediate and absolute. Bismarck was no longer just an enemy warship. She had become a symbol that had to be destroyed at all costs. British cruisers continued to shadow her, using radar to maintain contact even in poor visibility. Every report of her position was relayed across the Royal Navy. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers converged from multiple directions. The ocean itself seemed to close in. Bismarck, meanwhile, was running on borrowed time. The fuel leak forced Admiral Lutyens to abandon the original raiding plan and turn toward occupied France. The goal was now survival, not disruption of trade. Yet even this retreat was fraught with danger. German air cover could not reach far into the Atlantic, and the ship's reduced speed made evasion increasingly difficult. On May 26th, the decisive moment arrived. British carrier Ark Royal launched a strike of Swordfish torpedo bombers, obsolete biplanes flying in brutal weather conditions. Against all expectations, one torpedo struck Bismarck's stern and jammed her rudders. The most feared battleship in the world was suddenly crippled, unable to steer. She could still fire her guns, but she could no longer escape. Through the night, British destroyers harassed the immobilized ship, launching torpedoes and forcing the exhausted German crew to remain at battle stations. By morning, the end was inevitable. British battleships, King George V and Rodney, closed in and opened fire at point-blank range. Bismarck fought back with extraordinary resilience, absorbing hundreds of hits. Her guns were gradually silenced, her superstructure reduced to wreckage. Despite the punishment, she refused to sink quickly. Only after scuttling. Charges were detonated by her crew did. The great ship finally slipped beneath the waves. Over 2,000 German sailors went down with her. The sinking of Bismarck marked the end of Germany's surface fleet ambitions in the Atlantic. It was not merely the loss of a ship. It was the collapse of an entire strategic vision. The consequences of Bismarck's destruction went far beyond the loss of a single battleship. In Berlin, the sinking triggered a profound crisis of confidence within the German naval command. Adolf Hitler, already skeptical of surface fleet operations, interpreted the event as proof that large battleships were obsolete, liabilities rather than strategic assets. His trust in Admiral Erich Raeder collapsed. From this moment on, Hitler increasingly restricted the movement of remaining capital ships, especially Tirpitz, which would spend most of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords as a fleet in being rather than an active weapon. German surface warfare in the Atlantic was effectively over. The Kriegsmarine's focus shifted decisively toward submarines, which seemed better suited to wage an asymmetric war against British supply lines. Yet even this shift came too late to reverse the balance of power at sea. For the Royal Navy, the destruction of Bismarck was both a moral victory and a confirmation of doctrine. It proved that relentless pursuit, coordination between air and sea forces, and willingness to accept risk could defeat even the most powerful enemy unit. The loss of Hood had been avenged, and British control of the Atlantic, while still contested by U-boats, was no longer threatened by German battleships roaming the open ocean. Bismarck's final sortie also exposed the internal contradictions of German naval strategy. The ship had been designed as a raider, but she was hunted like a fleet flagship. She was ordered to avoid decisive battle, yet celebrated for winning one. Her commanders were torn between obedience to strategic caution and the realities of tactical opportunity. In the end, Bismarck was asked to be too many things at once: raider, symbol, deterrent, and prestige weapon. When she failed, the illusion of surface parity with Britain failed with her. The Atlantic War continued, but its character had changed forever. The era of the great battleship as a decisive, independent weapon was drawing to a close, replaced by air power, submarines, and intelligence-driven warfare. The story of Bismarck ultimately reveals a deeper truth about modern warfare at sea. Her loss was not simply the result of bad luck, superior enemy numbers, or technical failure. It was the consequence of a strategic vision that no longer matched reality. Germany entered the war with a surface fleet that was impressive on paper, but fragile in practice, too small to challenge British naval supremacy directly and too valuable to risk aggressively. Bismarck embodied this contradiction perfectly. She was built to inspire fear, project power, and symbolize German resurgence. Yet she operated under strict limitations that denied her the freedom such power required. When she finally sailed into the Atlantic, she did so alone, unsupported, and already constrained by strategic caution. Against her stood an enemy that understood the stakes and was willing to mobilize overwhelming forced to eliminate a single threat. The British response to Bismarck was not emotional excess, but strategic clarity. They recognized that as long as such a ship existed, it distorted every operational calculation in the Atlantic. Destroying her was not optional, it was necessary. In that sense, Bismarck was doomed the moment she was detected. Her fate also illustrates the transition from an older era of naval warfare to a new one. Battleships had once decided wars through firepower and armor. But by 1941, their dominance was being eroded by aircraft, submarines, radar, and signals intelligence. Bismarck fought bravely and inflicted real damage. Yet none of that could compensate for isolation, loss of mobility, and enemy control of the wider battle space. Today, Bismarck survives not as a weapon, but as a lesson. She reminds us that technology without coherent strategy is fragile, that symbols can become liabilities, and that wars are not won by individual machines, no matter how powerful, but by systems, coordination, and adaptability. In the cold waters of the Atlantic, the myth of the invincible battleship sank alongside Germany's last hope of challenging Britain on the open sea.